Reid's mornings began with the precise click of the coffee maker, a sound as predictable as the sunrise. He preferred his world in neat, catalogued rows, a habit honed over years spent meticulously preserving historical documents in the city's dusty municipal archives. His fingers, accustomed to the delicate rustle of aged paper, traced the spines of books on his shelf, a quiet ritual before he donned his sensible shoes and navigated the familiar route to his office. His life was a series of measured steps, each day a new page turned, but rarely a surprising one. He found solace in the quiet hum of his routines, the predictable ebb and flow of a life free from dramatic shifts. Then, the envelope arrived. It wasn't the usual utility bill or junk mail. The heavy cream stock, the formal script of the sender, a legal firm he'd never heard of, suggested something significant, something outside the bounds of his carefully constructed order. He opened it over his morning toast, the smell of burnt sugar suddenly cloying. The letter was brief, professional, and utterly disorienting. It informed him of the passing of a distant relative, a woman named Eleanor Vance, whom Reid vaguely recalled from a faded photograph, a ghost of a memory from a childhood funeral. He'd barely known her, yet the letter declared him the sole beneficiary of her estate. His inheritance, a property described only as Vance Cabin, deep within the forgotten woods of the Blackwood Range. A postscript, almost an afterthought, mentioned an attached underground bunker and advised immediate inspection and security measures. The words felt foreign on his tongue, a taste of something wild and untamed. A cabin? An underground bunker? His apartment, with its cityscape views and predictable rhythms, felt miles away from such a concept. He tried to recall anything about Eleanor, any anecdote or family lore, but his mind offered only a blank expanse. The legal representative, a stoic woman with a voice like polished stone, confirmed the details over the phone. He spoke of the cabin's isolation, its age, and a cryptic local rumor about the land it stood upon, something about ancient ground, though he quickly dismissed it as folklore. Reid, despite a natural inclination towards logic and reason, felt an unsettling prickle of curiosity. He wasn't one to shy away from a puzzle, and this was certainly that. A determined streak, usually reserved for deciphering faded script or organizing chaotic records, nudged him towards the unknown. He packed a single duffel, notified his supervisor of an impromptu leave, and set his GPS for a destination that slowly evaporated from the digital map as he drove. The paved roads eventually gave way to gravel, then to little more than twin ruts carved into the earth, overgrown with weeds. The air thickened, losing its city grit, replacing it with the damp, earthy scent of decaying leaves and pine needles. Sunlight, once a cheerful flood, now filtered through a dense canopy of ancient trees, creating a perpetual twilight. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of his tires and the distant, unseen cry of a bird. He drove for what felt like hours, the world shrinking around him, until the forest seemed to swallow the road whole. Then, through a sudden break in the trees, it appeared, the cabin. It wasn't picturesque or quaint. It was a hunched, weathered structure, its timber walls of faded gray, the roof sagging like a weary shoulder. A single, dark window stared out from the front, reflecting nothing but the oppressive green of the surrounding woods. It looked less like a home and more like something that had grown organically from the earth, a part of the forest itself. A shiver, not entirely due to the cool, damp air, traced its way down Reid's spine. The sense of isolation here was absolute, a heavy blanket that pressed down on his chest. He killed the engine, and the sudden quiet was deafening, a vacuum into which every rustle of leaves, every creak of unseen branches seemed to echo with unnatural clarity. He stepped out of the vehicle, the ground soft and spongy under his boots, the air thick with the smell of damp soil and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood mixed with rain. He walked around the cabin's perimeter, his gaze sweeping over the dilapidated porch, the peeling paint, the overgrown weeds that clawed at the foundation. The place felt abandoned, yet not empty. A palpable stillness hung in the air, a breath held. As he rounded the far side, hidden from the approach, he saw it. A low, square mound of earth, covered in moss and dead leaves, with a heavy, rusted metal hatch set flush with the ground. No handle, only a thick, iron ring, almost fused with corrosion. The underground bunker. Its presence was more menacing than he'd anticipated, a gaping maw in the earth, hinting at secrets buried deep. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration seemed to hum beneath his touch, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to originate from within the earth itself. He felt a distinct aversion, a primal urge to step away, to leave it undisturbed. But the determined part of him, the part that organized chaos and sought answers, held him rooted to the spot. This was his inheritance, his responsibility. And in that moment, standing before the silent, formidable presence of the underground bunker, Reid understood that his mundane life had just been irrevocably fractured. The tension in his shoulders tightened, a knot of unease coiling in his gut. Reid approached the cabin with the same methodical precision he applied to any new challenge. It was a structure of aged timber and weathered stone, hunkered low against the perpetual twilight of the surrounding forest. His first task, he decided, was not to unpack, but to understand the space. He moved through the rooms, a mental blueprint forming in his mind, cataloging the dusty furniture, the faded tapestries, the unsettling quiet that seemed to absorb all sound. He was a man who preferred facts, clear lines, and logical progressions, and this place, with its inherent disarray, presented an immediate, tangible puzzle. The first few days were spent in a whirlwind of practicalities. He aired out rooms, swept away decades of dust, and tried to coax a reluctant fire from the stone hearth. He attributed the occasional creak in the floorboards, the sigh of wind through ill-fitting window frames, and the distant rustle in the eaves to the house's advanced age. Every old building had its quirks, its groans and whispers. One evening, after wrestling with a stubbornly jammed window, Reid set a heavy, leather-bound book on a sturdy wooden table by the fireplace. He intended to read it later, a diversion from the cabin's pervasive silence. He went to the kitchen for water, returning less than a minute later. The book was gone. His gaze swept the table, then the floor. He frowned, a crease forming between his brows. He distinctly remembered placing it there. He checked the mantelpiece, the nearby armchair. Nothing. A prickle of unease, sharp and fleeting, touched him. He found the book, eventually, propped open on a high shelf in a different room, wedged between two obscure volumes he hadn't even touched. He shook his head, a wry smile playing on his lips. He must have been more tired than he thought, or perhaps he'd simply put it away on autopilot. It was an absent-minded mistake, nothing more. But the incidents began to accumulate. A faint scraping sound, like claws dragging across a wooden floor, would emanate from the attic when he was downstairs, only to cease the moment he ascended the stairs. He'd find a kitchen knife, cleaned and put away, inexplicably lying on the counter again, its handle slick with a faint, viscous residue that smelled faintly of brine. He attributed it to exhaustion, to the dim, uneven light filtering through the grimy panes, to the tricks of a mind unaccustomed to such profound isolation. He was an archivist, a man of records and verifiable data. He had no patience for phantom sensations. The cabin, however, seemed to have an endless supply of them. The air grew heavy in certain rooms, a palpable pressure that made his ears pop. A recurring, cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit left to rot, would seep into the air around him, thick and sickening, only to dissipate as quickly as it arrived. He found himself pausing, listening intently, his breath held, for sounds that never fully materialized. He was trying to rationalize, to find the loose floorboard, the draft, the rodent, the logical explanation. But the logic felt increasingly strained, stretched thin against a growing, shapeless current of wrongness. His curiosity, usually a benign intellectual pursuit, began to twist into something more urgent. He started to methodically examine the cabin, not just for habitability, but for answers. He tapped walls, peered into dusty recesses, searched for any hidden compartments or forgotten spaces. The air that wafted up from the opening was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something mineral and ancient, like rock that had never seen sunlight. He retrieved a lantern, its beam cutting a shaky path into the gloom. The stairs were crude, uneven, carved directly into the soil and rock. They spiraled down, deeper than he anticipated, until they opened into a cavernous, subterranean space. This was no simple cellar. This was an underground bunker. In the center of the bunker stood a crude stone table, its surface scarred and pitted. Upon it, bathed in the lantern's trembling light, lay a collection of objects that seemed to pulse with a quiet, unsettling significance. But it was the final item that drew his gaze and held it fast, a thick, leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age, secured with a tarnished, copper clasp. The leather felt strangely warm beneath his fingers, almost alive. He picked it up, the weight of it surprisingly heavy. The carvings, the stones, this hidden bunker, they were not the remnants of a quaint, eccentric relative. The rational explanations, the convenient dismissals, shattered around him like fragile glass. Reid's initial survey of the cabin had been meticulous, a systematic cataloging of its structure and contents. He'd approached it with the detached logic of an engineer dissecting a complex machine. Yet, the machine, it seemed, was alive, and it was beginning to hum with an unsettling frequency. It started subtly. A persistent, earthy scent would bloom in the air, not the rich loam of the forest floor, but something deeper, colder, like disturbed grave soil, only to vanish as quickly as it appeared. He'd blamed the draft, or the ancient timbers, or his own overworked senses. Then came the sounds. The cabin groaned, of course, a symphony of settling wood and wind, but sometimes, a distinct thump would echo from the floor above him when he was downstairs, or a soft, almost rhythmic scratching would emanate from behind a wall, too deliberate to be a mouse, too faint to pinpoint. He'd check, always. He'd find nothing. One evening, while reading by the flickering lamplight, a heavy, leather-bound book on the shelf above him toppled, striking the table with a startling crack. There was no tremor, no vibration to explain it. The air in the room had been perfectly still. Reid stared at the fallen volume, his breath catching in his throat. His rational mind, a fortress of logic and empirical observation, began to feel the first tremors of an assault. He picked up the book, examined the shelf. It was sturdy. He placed the book back, carefully, precisely. He watched it for long minutes, but it remained. Yet the seed of doubt, of something fundamentally wrong, had been planted. the incidents escalated. He'd leave a mug on the kitchen table only to find it on the counter, facing a different direction. A window he distinctly remembered latching would be open just a crack, letting in a whisper of cold, stale air that smelled faintly of something metallic. The methodical precision he usually applied was fraying at the edges, replaced by a growing unease that tightened his chest. He couldn't dismiss it as fatigue anymore. The cabin was not just old, it was active. It was responding. This wasn't a problem to be solved with tools or structural analysis. This was something else. His distant relative, the one he barely knew, now seemed less a forgotten name and more a key to a terrifying puzzle. He began his research in the cabin itself, poring over dusty ledgers, faded photographs, and journals filled with elegant, looping script that grew increasingly frantic in later entries. The journals, in particular, offered tantalizing, unsettling clues. They spoke of the land, not as property, but as a living entity, demanding respect, demanding something more. There were oblique references to old agreements and the deep earth. The relative's handwriting, initially steady, devolved into hurried scrawls, often accompanied by crude, repetitive sketches of intertwined roots and distorted faces. It wasn't a topographical survey, but a rough sketch of the cabin's immediate surroundings, marked with strange symbols and an arrow pointing away from the structure, deep into a thicket of gnarled pines. Beside the arrow, scrawled in a shaky hand, were the words, "Below the roots. The keeper of secrets." The air in the cabin seemed to thicken, pressing in on Reid as he deciphered the cryptic message. He found it nestled into a slight depression in the earth, almost entirely overgrown with moss and ivy, a low, weathered wooden door, reinforced with rusted iron bands, set into a mound of earth and stone. It was a hidden entrance, almost swallowed by the forest floor. With a heavy sense of foreboding, Reid wrestled with the swollen timber, the wood groaning in protest. He had found the underground bunker. It was a single, surprisingly spacious chamber, carved directly into the earth, its walls lined with rough-hewn timber and shelves overflowing with more books, rolled parchments, and strange, unlabeled jars. This wasn't a storage cellar, it was a research sanctuary, or perhaps, a tomb of forgotten knowledge. The air in the bunker was heavy, stagnant, as if the very passage of time had slowed here. Dust motes danced in his flashlight beam like spectral entities. He pulled a thick, leather-bound volume from a shelf. Its pages were brittle, filled with meticulously copied local legends. One particular passage made his stomach clench. The earth remembers. The old blood calls. It wants more than memory. It wants. Reid's hands trembled as he turned the pages. The cabin wasn't merely haunted, it was a nexus, a focal point for something ancient and hungry. His relative hadn't simply died, he had been consumed by the very thing Reid was now uncovering. He was no longer just a curious inheritor, he was a potential inheritor of a terrible, generations-old debt. The scratches in the journal, those frantic, childish stick figures encircling a formless blot, clawed at Reid's mind. It wants more than memory. It wants acknowledgement. The words of his distant relative, scrawled in a hand that grew increasingly erratic, echoed in the oppressive quiet of the cabin. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. What kind of acknowledgement? And what did those crude drawings truly represent? He traced the edges of the amorphous shape with a trembling finger, a sense of profound unease settling over him like a shroud. He pushed away from the dusty table, the ancient wood groaning softly in protest. The cabin felt different now, less a place of mystery and more a cage. He needed answers, something concrete to anchor himself against the swirling tide of paranoia. He began to search, methodically at first, then with a growing desperation, for anything else his relative might have hidden. His gaze fell upon the stone hearth, its rough-hewn blocks a stark contrast to the cabin's timber walls. There was a faint discoloration on the floor directly in front of it, a subtle difference in the patina of the old planks. He knelt, running his hand over the wood. He pressed harder, testing the grain, his fingers seeking an edge, a seam. And there it was. A barely perceptible line, almost perfectly camouflaged by age and grime, outlining a square section of the floor. He fumbled for a loose floorboard nearby, using its edge to pry. This wasn't a crawlspace for pipes or wiring, this was a descent. He grabbed a lantern, its glass dusty but intact, and lit it with a trembling hand. Taking a deep breath, he lowered himself into the opening, his boots finding purchase on crude, uneven stone steps. The light from the lantern struggled against the overwhelming gloom, revealing walls of rough-hewn rock, slick with moisture. He was in an underground bunker. The realization hit him with a jolt. Not a cellar, not a simple root storage, but a deliberate, fortified space, buried deep beneath the earth. The lantern light barely reached the far walls, but it illuminated a central stone slab, almost like an altar, and shelves carved into the rock, laden with what looked like more journals, some bound in leather, others in rough cloth, all appearing far older than the one he'd just found. He approached the stone slab first. There were more of those amorphous shapes, accompanied by stylized figures that were clearly not human, their limbs elongated, their heads unsettlingly small. And surrounding them, the same concentric circles from the journal sketches. He reached for the oldest-looking journal on the shelf, its leather cover cracked and brittle. The pages within were parchment, filled with faded, spidery script in an archaic hand. He had to squint, holding the lantern closer, to decipher the words. It was a chronicle, a history, penned by an ancestor whose name he didn't recognize. The entries spoke of the land, of the forest, of a presence that predated their arrival. The old ones knew it. One entry read, the ink almost entirely faded. The hunger of the earth. We built here, on sacred ground, and disturbed its slumber. The first harvest failed. The livestock sickened. The children wept with fevers that burned them from within. Reid's breath hitched. Sacred ground. He turned the page, his fingers stiff. The seer came, from the hidden village. She spoke of a pact, a binding. To appease the spirit of the land. To feed it, so it would not feed upon us. A lineage must be bound, a sacrifice offered, generation to generation, to maintain the balance. A drop of blood for a year of peace. A life for a century of plenty. The words swam before Reid's eyes, each one a hammer blow to his carefully constructed reality. A pact. A sacrifice. His lineage. The amorphous shapes, the stick figures, they weren't just drawings, they were records of horrific rituals, of offerings made to it. The entity wasn't just haunting the cabin, it was an ancient, malevolent force woven into the very fabric of the earth beneath his feet, demanding its due. He skimmed further, finding entries detailing the rituals, the specific times of year, the chosen sacrifices, always a member of the family, always someone lost to the community, someone who would not be missed. The last entry in this particular journal was stark, a desperate plea, the land grows restless. The pact weakens. The blood thins. It demands more. He looked around the underground bunker, at the rough stone walls, the eerie carvings, the silent, waiting journals. This wasn't just history, it was a living, breathing horror. The entity wasn't just tied to the land, it was the land, and it was awakening. And it wanted its payment. His payment. A cold sweat broke out on Reid's brow. He snatched the closest journal, its leather cover slick with a faint, unidentifiable film. His fingers trembled as he flipped past the brittle, yellowed pages, seeking confirmation, a way out, anything. The script was an antiquated hand, tight and deliberate. He skimmed, his eyes catching phrases, the sacrifice, the binding, the payment due. A particular passage arrested him, a chilling account of a ritual performed generations ago, not just to appease, but to contain. It spoke of a lineage chosen, not blessed, but burdened. His lineage. As he read, the air in the bunker grew impossibly still, then began to press in, thick and suffocating. Reid blinked, certain he saw the ancient lines on the stone move, a slow, serpentine undulation beneath the dust and grime. He squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them wide. The carvings were still, inert stone. His heart hammered against his ribs. Just my imagination. But then, a low, resonant hum began, vibrating not in the air, but in the very stone beneath his boots. It grew, a deep thrumming that resonated in his teeth, shaking the dust from the ceiling in fine, gritty showers. The journals on the table began to tremble, their pages rustling as if caught in an unseen breeze. One, left open, slammed shut with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. This wasn't his mind playing tricks. This was real. The entity, whatever it was, knew he was here. It knew he was reading. It was reacting. A primal fear seized him, urging him to flee, to abandon the journals, the cabin, everything. He scrambled towards the narrow, stone-cut passage that led out of the bunker, his hand reaching for the rough wooden door. It was deep, raw, and utterly inhuman, vibrating through his chest cavity. The sudden, total blackness was a physical assault. He could feel eyes on him, a crushing weight of unseen presence. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers shaking so violently he almost dropped it. In that fleeting glow, he saw it. The carvings on the wall directly opposite him. They weren't just moving, they were shifting. The lines, once rigid, now flowed like liquid, coalescing into something recognizable, something monstrous. A gaunt, skeletal face, its mouth agape in a silent scream, its eyes, empty sockets, seemed to bore into him. He tore his gaze away, fighting down a wave of nausea, and burst through the bunker door, scrambling up the narrow, winding steps. He didn't stop until he reached the cabin's main floor, gasping for air, leaning against the sturdy oak table, his body trembling uncontrollably. The cabin, usually so quiet, now felt charged, alive with a malevolent energy. He scrolled to the contact for the colleague who had helped him settle some initial affairs. The call connected, but the line was thick with static. "Hello? Can you hear me?" Reid yelled into the receiver, his voice hoarse. "Reid? Is that you?" The colleague's voice crackled, distant and distorted, laced with an odd, high-pitched whine. "The line. It's terrible. Are you all right? You sound frantic." "No, Reid, am not all right. Something is here, in the cabin." I found a wave of static, sharper, more violent than before, drowned out his words. It wasn't just static, it sounded like tearing metal, then a distorted, inhuman shriek that made him drop the phone. He stared at the phone, then slowly, hesitantly, picked it up. No service. He tried again. Nothing. The signal bars were completely gone. The cabin, which had felt isolated, now felt utterly cut off. A trap. He walked to the window, peering out into the deepening twilight. The forest, once a comforting blanket of green, now seemed to press in, the ancient trees like skeletal fingers reaching for the cabin. A low, scraping sound came from the floorboards directly above him in the empty bedroom. Creak. Drag. Scrape. It was slow, deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across the old wood. Reid froze, his eyes wide. He was alone in the cabin. He had been alone for days. But he was no longer. The entity wasn't just in the bunker. It was here. With him. And it was making its presence known. The covenant wasn't just a historical document, it was a living, breathing promise, and the time for payment was drawing near. He was trapped, and the cabin was slowly, deliberately, becoming his tomb. The phone lay on the rough floorboards, its screen a shattered kaleidoscope of pixels and static. The shriek, no longer a mere memory, vibrated in Reid's bones, a visceral echo that clawed at the lining of his skull. He stared at the device, a cold dread seeping into his fingertips. Then clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a malfunction. This was a message. A declaration. And he was done listening. He snatched the phone, his hand trembling slightly. The screen was black now, utterly dead. He tried the power button, then jabbed it repeatedly, his thumb frantic. Nothing. Just a blank, unforgiving slab of plastic and glass. He threw it onto the worn armchair, a futile gesture of defiance. No help was coming. He was alone. But he wouldn't stay. A desperate resolve hardened in his chest. He would leave. Now. Not tomorrow, not after another night of torment, but now. He grabbed his jacket, the rough denim a small comfort against the prickling fear on his skin. Keys. He fumbled in his pocket, the cold metal a reassuring weight. He'd drive out, keep driving until the cabin was a distant, forgotten nightmare. The front door groaned open, spitting him into the twilight. The ancient trees loomed, their skeletal branches clawing at the bruised sky, more menacing than usual. He tried to ignore the oppressive quiet, the feeling of unseen eyes tracking his every move. He strode towards the old pickup, its paint faded and chipped, parked haphazardly beneath a towering pine. He yanked the driver's side door open, the rusty hinges protesting with a drawn-out shriek that made him flinch. He slid into the worn seat, the springs groaning beneath his weight, and jammed the key into the ignition. He turned it. The engine coughed once, a weak, pathetic wheeze, then fell silent. He tried again and again. Frustration surged, hot and bitter. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel, the impact rattling his teeth. "Come on," he snarled, his voice hoarse. He tried a fifth time, holding the key, praying for a spark of life. Dead. Completely. He slumped back, his breath ragged. The entity wasn't just in the cabin, it extended its reach. It was outside. It was the forest. A new surge of determination, fueled by a frantic energy, spurred him into action. He would walk. He wasn't that far from the main road, maybe an hour or two on foot. He plunged into the tree line, ignoring the faint, almost imperceptible rustling that seemed to follow him. He pushed through low-hanging branches that clawed at his face and hair, the rough bark scraping against his skin. The forest floor grew softer, muddier, the air thick with the smell of wet decay. He was certain he was heading in the right direction, yet the trees seemed to grow denser, the undergrowth thicker, an impenetrable wall of green and brown. He pushed aside a curtain of moss-draped vines, stepping into a small clearing, and stopped dead. Before him, half swallowed by earth and ivy, was a structure he'd never seen. Not a natural outcropping, but something built, something ancient and forgotten. A heavy, rusted metal door, thick as a bank vault, was set into a low, earthen mound. It had no handle, only a massive, corroded iron ring, almost fused to the metal by years of neglect. Above it, carved into a rough stone lintel, was a symbol. A crude, swirling vortex, sharp angles twisting into an impossible knot, identical to the faint etching he'd found on the cabin's hearth. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a path out. This was a path further in. The forest hadn't allowed him to escape, it had guided him, herded him, to this hidden place. The entity wasn't just claiming the cabin, it had roots, deep and far-reaching, beneath the very ground he stood on. His breath hitched. He wasn't lost, he was trapped. The forest was a cage, and this bunker was a deeper cell. His desperate flight had only led him to another, more ominous part of his inheritance. He backed away slowly, his eyes wide, fixed on the swirling symbol that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy in the dimming light. He turned, scrambling back through the undergrowth, his earlier determination replaced by raw panic. He ran, blindly now, the branches whipping at him, the rough ground tripping his feet. He ran until his lungs screamed, until his vision blurred, until he collapsed against the gnarled trunk of an ancient oak, gasping for air. The trees swayed, not with wind, but with a slow, deliberate motion, like watchful sentinels. He was back. The short, desperate trek had brought him in a full circle, not to the main road, but home. To his prison. He stumbled back inside, the cabin's interior now feeling less like a refuge and more like a tomb. It wasn't just a sense of unease, it was a physical pressure, a vast, unseen weight pressing down on him, distorting the very air. He heard a faint scratching from behind the walls, a rhythmic, insistent sound, like claws on old wood, growing louder, closer. His sanity, already frayed, began to unravel, thread by agonizing thread. He wasn't just trapped, he was being toyed with. And the game was far from over. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a physical assault. The entity was growing bolder, more desperate, less interested in subtlety. He backed away from the device, the metallic tang of fear sharp in his mouth. The answer, the only path to understanding, lay elsewhere. He thought of the faded, almost invisible symbol he'd found etched into the underside of the old mantelpiece, a spiraling knot of lines that seemed to point both inward and down. With a deep, shuddering breath, Reid grabbed his backpack, already packed with essentials, a powerful flashlight, a water bottle, a small multi-tool, and the tattered journal he'd found hidden in the cabin's attic. He moved through the cabin, no longer tiptoeing, but with a desperate stride. He didn't bother with the front door. The entity had claimed this space. He found the loose floorboard in the pantry, pried it up, and descended into the narrow, earth-walled root cellar. He pressed against the far wall, searching for the hidden catch, the mechanism hinted at by the mantelpiece carving. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a cramped, lightless tunnel that smelled of stagnant air and something metallic, like old blood or rust. This was it. This was where the lineage had truly hidden its secrets. Each step echoed, amplified by the confined space, making him jump at his own movements. The air grew heavier, pressing in on his chest, tasting of mineral and age. He could feel the weight of the earth above him, a suffocating blanket. This was the underground bunker. The flashlight beam struggled to pierce the gloom, revealing only fragments, immense, rough-hewn stone walls, a low, arched ceiling dripping with moisture, and a floor of uneven flagstones slick with condensation. It wasn't a sound, not precisely, but a vibration, a pressure. The walls were not bare. They were covered in carvings, intricate and disturbing. They seemed to writhe in the flickering light, caught in a perpetual agony. Surrounding it were smaller, upright slabs, like forgotten headstones, each bearing more of the grotesque carvings. They were slate, thick and heavy, covered in a script he didn't recognize, yet felt horrifyingly familiar. He pulled on a pair of thin gloves from his pack before touching them, his fingers trembling. He ran his flashlight beam over the first tablet. The script was indecipherable, but interwoven were pictograms, crude drawings of the cabin, the forest, and the same gaunt figures from the walls, but now, they were depicted receiving something, feeding from something. He moved to the next tablet. Here, the pictograms became clearer, more horrifying. Human figures, clearly recognizable as his ancestors from old photographs he'd seen in the cabin, stood before the gaunt entities. This wasn't a curse, it was a pact. A contract, etched in stone and blood. His ancestors, generations ago, had made a bargain for what? Prosperity? Protection from some unknown blight? The carvings implied a desperate exchange, a terrible price paid for something they desired. He found the final tablet. It depicted a cycle, the offering, the feeding, a period of calm, then the entity growing restless, its hunger returning, demanding renewal. And then, a new image, a figure. Unmistakably Reid's distant relative, the one who had owned the cabin before him, turning away, refusing. The relative was depicted falling, crumbling, absorbed. The shriek from the cabin returned, not just an echo now, but a resonant hum in the bunker itself, vibrating through the stones, through Reid's very bones. The air grew thick and heavy, tasting of ozone and something ancient, something that had been waiting. The pressure on his ears intensified, a dull ache that grew into a piercing stab. The flashlight beam flickered, dimming, then brightening erratically, as if struggling against an unseen force. He understood. The entity wasn't a ghost, it was a primal hunger, a parasitic force tied to this land, sustained by a generational pact. His ancestors had appeased it with blood, with life itself, ensuring their own survival and perhaps a twisted form of prosperity. The pact had been broken by his relative, and now, the entity was starved, enraged, reclaiming what it was owed. And Reid, the last living descendant of that bloodline, was the final offering. The final pictograph on the cracked tablet showed a single figure, alone, facing the monstrous entity. This wasn't just a sacrifice, it was an absorption. The entity didn't just want a life, it wanted him. His essence, his lineage, his very being. And there was no escaping it. The bunker walls seemed to close in, the carved figures twisting into mocking, hungry grins. Reid was trapped, not just in this ancient tomb, but in a lineage of sacrifice, and the hunger was here. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a siege. Every instinct screamed for him to flee, to abandon this wretched place, but a stubborn resolve, forged in the terror of the past days, took root. He wouldn't run. Not anymore. He needed answers, needed to confront whatever malevolence clung to this land, this cabin, this lineage. He remembered the faint, metallic tang in the air, not just of decay, but something deeper, almost subterranean, that he'd dismissed as an old cabin's quirks. He'd noticed a particular floorboard in the pantry, slightly warped, perpetually damp, even when the rest of the cabin felt dry. He moved, his limbs stiff, towards the pantry, the splintered wood groaning under his weight. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of wet earth and something else, something cloying and ancient, like dust mixed with dried blood. He knelt, prying at the loose board with the edge of a rusty chisel he'd found in a forgotten drawer. A rush of stale, cold air, carrying the reek of mildew and deep-buried secrets, assaulted him. This was it. The source. The heart of the rot. He retrieved a lantern from the mantelpiece, its glass chimney smudged with soot, and lit the wick. The ladder ended on a packed earth floor. This was an underground bunker. Strange symbols, crude and unsettling, were carved into the stone, some blackened with what looked like dried resin, others worn smooth by time. These weren't decorative, they were protective, or perhaps, binding. He moved deeper into the bunker. The only sound was the scuff of his boots and the frantic, shallow beat of his own heart. It was a visual history, a terrifying lineage. At the end of the passage, the bunker opened into a larger, circular room. Around it, carved into the floor, was a complex glyph, glowing faintly with an internal, sickly green light that pulsed in rhythm with some unseen force. On the altar, nestled amongst dried, crumbling leaves and desiccated husks, lay a single, leather-bound tome. Its cover was unadorned, save for a single, deeply etched symbol, the same vortex he'd seen in the passage, but this one seemed to drink the light. He pulled back, gasping. The air around him shimmered, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from the very stone of the bunker. He forced himself to touch the book again, this time seizing it. Its pages, brittle and yellowed, were filled with a spidery script, indecipherable at first. But as he focused, a horrifying clarity descended. The words didn't just appear, they unfurled in his mind, a torrent of ancient knowledge and terrible truth. This wasn't just a journal, it was a ledger of souls. The pact. It wasn't just a bargain for prosperity or protection. It was a feeding. Generations of his family, his lineage, had been bound to this entity, offering up their essence, their very life force, to sustain it. The sudden, mysterious deaths weren't accidents, they were harvests. And the ultimate sacrifice? It wasn't just a life. It was the willing surrender of a soul, freely given, to perpetuate the entity's hold, ensuring its immortality through the bloodline. The book detailed a specific ritual, a binding of the current host to the entity, a final, complete consumption. A name appeared on a page, stark and accusing, Reid. This wasn't just about a relative, it was about him. He was the designated conduit, the final offering. The full, horrific weight of his inheritance crashed down on him. He wasn't just uncovering a secret, he was the secret. As the realization solidified, the bunker itself began to writhe. The stone walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting. The entity was here, in its full power, responding to the clarity of his understanding. It wasn't a physical form he could fight with his fists, but a pervasive, consuming presence. Visions flashed before his eyes, distorted faces of forgotten ancestors, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes pleading. But the book also held another truth, buried deep within its cryptic passages, a counter-ritual, a way to sever the connection, not by offering a soul, but by rejecting the pact, by denying the entity its sustenance, by burning the lineage's binding. It would require an act of pure defiance, a willing sacrifice of the pact itself, which could also destroy him in the process, but it was his only chance. The air grew thick, making it hard to breathe. His resolve wavered, a fragile flame against a hurricane. He wouldn't be another name in this ledger of despair. With a roar that was more defiance than courage, Reid stumbled towards the altar. The ground trembled beneath him, and the green glyph on the floor flared violently, threatening to engulf him. He fought them, a desperate, animalistic struggle, his muscles screaming, his breath ragged. The counter-ritual was simple in its instruction, terrifying in its implication, a complete rejection, a severance that would either free him or consume him entirely. He had to become the end of the line, even if it meant his own end. He fumbled in his pocket, retrieving the last match from a small box. His hands shook violently. The entity's presence intensified, a suffocating pressure, attempting to extinguish his will, to shatter his focus. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated rage and hunger. He struck the match against the rough stone of the altar. He held it, his gaze fixed on the ancient tome, on the symbol of the vortex, ready to make his stand. The silence that followed was not a reprieve, but a vacuum. It pulled at Reid's eardrums, leaving them hollowed and aching. The phone lay on the rough floorboards, its screen a shattered kaleidoscope of pixels and static, a dead eye staring up at nothing. Every muscle protested, a symphony of dull aches and sharp, localized pains. He pushed himself onto his hands and knees, the coarse concrete floor of the underground bunker scraping against his palms. He coughed, a dry, ragged sound that seemed to shatter the fragile quiet. The ringing in his ears slowly receded, replaced by the low thrum of his own pulse, a frantic drumbeat against the inside of his temples. He dragged himself upright, bracing a hand against the cool, unforgiving concrete wall. His left arm throbbed, a deep, bruising ache that radiated from his shoulder down to his wrist. He peeled back the sleeve of his shirt, revealing an angry, purple welt blooming across his forearm, a grotesque imprint of unseen force. He didn't remember the impact, only the overwhelming pressure, the sense of being crushed. The bunker itself seemed to breathe, a damp, living thing. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, which had flickered violently during the confrontation, now cast a weak, unwavering glow. Dust motes, disturbed by the unseen maelstrom, slowly settled back onto the grimy surfaces. Reid's eyes scanned the chamber. Cracks spiderwebbed across the concrete, fresh wounds in the bunker's aged skin. A section of wall near where he'd been standing was deeply gouged, as if something impossibly sharp had raked across it. He traced the damage with a trembling finger, the concrete gritty beneath his touch. This wasn't just a psychological assault, it had been a physical one, too. The entity, whatever it was, had left its mark. The heavy, steel door that sealed the bunker from the cabin above remained closed, but its frame was subtly twisted, a testament to the immense forces that had been unleashed. And he had, somehow, held it back. He stumbled towards a low, wooden crate in the center of the bunker, collapsing onto it. His breath hitched, a shudder running through him. He was alive. He had survived. The cost was already etched into him. The physical pain was one thing, a temporary torment. His gaze fell upon a small, tarnished silver locket that lay half-buried in a pile of disturbed dust near the gouged wall. He hadn't seen it before. It was old, intricate, with a faint, almost illegible engraving on its surface. He reached for it, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. It was heavy, surprisingly so, and when he pried it open, he found it empty. No faded photograph, no dried flower. A shiver traced its way down his spine. Had it been there all along, or had it been left behind? A relic of the pact, perhaps? A forgotten sacrifice? And neither would he. The confrontation had stripped something vital from him, leaving him raw and exposed. His perception of reality was irrevocably altered, the line between sanity and madness blurred beyond recognition. He stood, the locket clutched tight in his hand. The underground bunker, once a place of terrifying power, now felt merely exhausted. Like a beast that had spent its fury and fallen into a fitful slumber. The horror wasn't gone. It had simply found a new home. The shriek, a raw tearing sound that had vibrated through the very marrow of his bones, had not been the end. It had been the turning point. Reid remembered the sudden, crushing silence that followed, heavier than any noise. He hadn't understood it then, not fully, but the pact, the ancient, hungry agreement, had finally been addressed. Not broken, not entirely, but acknowledged. And perhaps, in that moment of absolute surrender to the fear, in that desperate, wordless plea, he had offered something new, something different to the hunger. A portion of himself, a piece of his future, not his life, but his peace. He found himself later, much later, in the oppressive chill of the underground bunker. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and stale earth, a stark contrast to the verdant, cloying breath of the forest above. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light slicing through a grimy vent high in the concrete ceiling, illuminating the worn, rusting tools scattered on a workbench. The phone, shattered and useless, was still in his pocket. A dead weight. He remembered the caller's voice, the fear in it, the sudden, terrible cut-off. He hadn't been able to help them, not really. He had been too deep in his own struggle, too entangled in the cabin's ancient web. Reid's gaze drifted across the bunker's rough walls. He'd stumbled down here, driven by an instinct he couldn't name, and urged to burrow away from the light, from the open sky that now felt too vast, too watchful. He sat on an upturned crate, the rough wood digging into his thighs. Every muscle in his body ached, a deep, persistent throb that resonated with a weariness far beyond physical exertion. It was the exhaustion of a soul dragged through a grinder, stretched and twisted. The truth, when it had finally revealed itself, wasn't a grand, shattering epiphany, but a slow, creeping understanding. The pact wasn't about blood sacrifice in the way he'd imagined, not in the direct, brutal sense. It was about connection. About the family's presence, their roots in the land, feeding the entity not with lifeblood, but with their experience. Their fear, their joy, their sorrow, their very essence, distilled over generations, a potent elixir for something that had no corporeal form, only an insatiable appetite for human emotion. And he, Reid, had become the latest conduit. He hadn't vanquished it. He had merely satisfied it, For now. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble, the grime. His eyes, when he finally looked at his reflection in a small, cracked mirror hanging near the workbench, were not his own. They were wider, deeper, flecked with a kind of desperate clarity he hadn't possessed before. They held the shadow of things seen, things understood that should never be known. He had walked through a doorway and couldn't unlock it. The world now seemed thinner, more translucent, as if the veil between reality and something else had been permanently frayed. He needed to leave. He stood, his movements stiff and deliberate. He gathered a few meager supplies, a bottle of water, a half-eaten energy bar he'd found in a forgotten corner. Survival was a simple, stark command now. The light filtering through the hatch above was blinding, not because of its intensity, but because his eyes had grown accustomed to the deep gloom. When he emerged, the forest greeted him with an unnerving stillness. The birds weren't singing. The leaves barely rustled. It was as if the entire woods held its breath, watching him. It didn't menace him, not anymore. It simply was Star. A monument to a lineage of fear, and now, to his own unwilling participation. He understood that he couldn't stay. He couldn't burn it down, couldn't erase what had happened. It was a part of him now, woven into the fabric of his being. He walked away from the cabin, not looking back. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, made him flinch. He knew it wasn't over. The entity had been sated, not destroyed. And he, Reid, carried its mark. The pact wasn't broken, it had merely been redefined. He reached the edge of the forest, where the tree line met the overgrown track leading back to the world of paved roads and indifferent strangers. The sun, a pale disk in the sky, offered no warmth, only a stark illumination of the path ahead. He was no longer just Reid, he was a vessel, forever changed, forever marked. The world might have seemed the same, but he knew better. And that knowledge, that terrible, intimate understanding, was his true, permanent scar.